First speaker, Mr. Paul Tuson from Tetra Tech, will present on the topic Power System Optimization, a case study of Barbados and Uzbekistan. So Mr. Paul Tuson, the next 30 minutes is yours.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for the slide. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Paul Tuson. I'm Energy Sector Director at Tetra Tech. I'm going to be presenting two case studies on power system planning and integrated resource and resilience planning. The first country is Uzbekistan, and the second country is Barbados. Next slide, please. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Key features of the Uzbekistan energy system are as follows. It is well connected with its Central and South Asian neighbors, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan. And it's also connected to Russia in the north through Kazakhstan. There are moves towards a Central Asia, South Asia regional market called CASAREM, C-A-S-A-R-E-M. At the time of the study, Uzbekistan included aging gas steam power plants and hydro power plants, and included no renewable energy power plants or energy storage power plants. Due to Uzbekistan's connection to the larger Kazakhstan and Russian power systems in the north, the Uzbekistan generators were all operating in power control mode and not in frequency control mode, as frequency governing was largely undertaken by Russia. A relatively simplistic intertrip scheme was in place to trip load on the loss of Uzbekistan generation and when intertie flows exceeded contracted levels. No automatic dispatch system, ADS, or automatic generator control system, JGSEE, was in place. A power system planning study was commissioned by the Asian Development Bank, ADB. A demand forecast was undertaken together with a generation planning study and a transmission planning study. Electrified transport and the transport component of the energy balance was not considered. The study was done a few years ago. Next slide, please. From the figure, it can be seen how well connected Uzbekistan is with its Central and Southern Asian neighbors. Uzbekistan is the green country in the center. As mentioned, Central Asia is connected to the large 300 gigawatt Russian power system north of Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is to the north of Uzbekistan. Next slide. This figure shows the high voltage transmission lines connecting the different countries. The lines are shown in bold red. Over the years, there have been political tensions between some of the Central Asian countries, and the transmission interconnectors have been opened and flows between the connecting countries terminated. Next slide. As part of the master plan, we undertook a demand forecast and we generated high, medium, or base, or expected, and low demand forecasts to 2038. The demand forecasts were primarily based on forecasted GDP from the Ministry of Finance and the historical and projected correlations between annual energy and GDP. The slide, although the slide shows average annual demands, the demand that were undertaken at a much higher resolution to give hourly demands throughout the time horizon. Next slide, please. Carbon pricing by request of the client was not used in the analysis. The figure shows the megawatt capacity results of the least cost generation planning analysis based on the demand forecast. Uzbekistan is mostly desert and dry and has significant solar resources. So of note in the figure is the significant growth in solar PV, yellow bars, going up to 2038. Wind resources are less prominent in Uzbekistan, but they also grow to 2038, the green bars at the top of the figure above the yellow bars. Battery energy storage complements the growth in renewable energy, the green bars. Natural gas, the gray bars, initially has an increase due to existing capacity shortages. At the time, Uzbekistan was load shedding. This increase in gas capacity is associated with retirement of old inefficient gas generation assets and the commissioning of new gas turbines and reciprocating engines, internal combustion engines, ICEs. Due to the retirement of generation, a net generation capacity remains, shown by the bold red line. Next slide, please. This figure shows the energy in megawatt hours results of the least cost energy plan. The energy requirement of gas, the gray lines, reduced to 2038, while the energy requirement of solar, gold bars, wind and hydro and imports increase. Some legacy coal energy still remains in the plan. Going forward, if further IRRP studies are undertaken, it is feasible that the coal and gas energy allocations could reduce further. Next slide, please. This figure shows the evolution of imports, blue bars, and exports, red bars, and increased trade with Central and Southern Asian neighbors up to 2038. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have surplus hydro generation in the wet seasons, and they import gas power from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in the dry seasons, in the winter seasons. Next slide. With the introduction of renewable energy resources, curtailment is inevitable. Curtailment, the gray bars, is not a bad thing, as the energy cost from renewable energy generation is close to zero, and surplus renewable energy is required to take into account extended bad weather periods, the capacity factors of wind and solar, and the normal diurnal renewable energy patterns. Example, the sun does not shine at night. Of note, in the left of the figure are the high unserved energy bars at the commencement of the study, the orange and blue, which were rapidly improved with the injection of new thermal energy storage and renewable generation capacity in the study. Next slide, please. For power systems to operate effectively, sufficient spinning reserve is required. This figure shows the improvement in spinning reserves from roughly 3% at the commencement of the study to close to 17% on completion of the study period. This spinning reserve is made up from imports, gas turbines, batteries, the largest contributor, and some hydro generation. Next slide, please. This figure shows a typical 3-day generation dispatch capacity profile in megawatts in the study horizon. So you can see that the demand was chronological and undertaken on an hourly basis. Of note is the gold PV comprising large daytime capacity, wind and hydro complementing the solar in the evenings, the blue, and batteries used at peak times, the dark green. The gas generation can be seen to provide the base generation requirement. The red dotted line shows the price of electricity increasing at times of system peak. Next slide, please. As mentioned, large capital spend on new generation assets, blue bars, required at the commencement of the study horizon for the following reason: to improve unserved energy, to replace old, inefficient generation with more efficient, reliable, and flexible plant, and the decrease in energy tariffs by the introduction of low-cost RE generation. The green line shows the cumulative capacity increase over the study horizon. A steep cumulative capacity increase is required at the beginning of the study horizon, and it can be seen to taper off towards the end of the study horizon. Next slide, please. Transmission analysis was undertaken over the study horizon to incorporate increases in load and new thermal, hydro, renewable and storage assets, and increased imports. The figure shows a schematic representation of the transmission system at the commencement of the study in 2018. The red lines are 500 kV transmission lines, and the black lines are the 220 kV assets. Square blocks show the power stations, and the circles show the substations. Dig silent power system analysis was undertaken for different study years, incorporating the new demand and the new generation, and static and dynamic studies were undertaken for normal N-0 and emergency N-1 system conditions. Studies were also undertaken for different times of the day, example noon, system peak, system minimum, etc. Next slide, please. The figure shows the final transmission system in 2038. Proposed 500 kV and 220 kV assets are shown as dotted lines. In some areas, large increments of wind and solar were required, and a lot of transmission infrastructure was required. Next slide. Further interesting findings in the study we undertook are as follows. As Uzbekistan increases its penetration of renewable energy, its internal requirement for flexible generation or energy storage will increase. It was recommended that whilst Uzbekistan should trade with its neighbors, its dependence on primary or FCR reserve from Russia should be reduced, and it should become energy and capacity independent. It was recommended that power plants should run in speed control or governing mode, and that ADS, AGC systems should be implemented. The ADS, AGC system should work in conjunction with an area control error, ACE system, as shown in the following slides. Large ramping and flexible generation and energy storage reserves are required, and climate change and system resilience factors should be introduced into the planning. Example, reduced glacial hydro flows and changing rainfall and precipitation patterns. Next slide, please. Some possible lessons for Thailand are as follows. Conduct regular country and regional IRRPs integrated resource and resilience plans, possibly every 2 years, using the tools described in the courses, example PIPESA and DigSilent. Individual country reserves can be reduced via more interconnected systems. Regional interconnectors also provide generation source diversity due to weather and resilience to extreme weather events. ADS, AGC, and ACE systems should be introduced. Flexible generation and energy storage should be introduced as the penetration of renewable inverter-based generation increases. And if the penetration of renewable increases steadily, the introduction of synchronous condensers, which can then supply inertia, fault level, and dynamic reactive power response. Next slide, please. I'd like to move on to Barbados. We also did an integrated resource and resilience plan for this country. It can be seen there in the slide as a small island, 30 kilometers by 20 kilometers roughly, and it's in the Caribbean belt, just north of South America and to the southeast of North America. Next slide, please. So Barbados is a geographical and electrical island. It is not interconnected with other islands and lands. Barbados is totally responsible for managing its energy balance, that is, matching generation with demand. Barbados's power utility is privately owned and managed, and the company is called the Barbados Light and Power Company, BLPC. At the time of the study, BLPC was 100% reliant on imported diesel and heavy fuel oil, HFO, fuels for power generation. The other half of Barbados's power balance comprised fuels for transport and shipping, but this half of the power balance was not part of our study. The Barbados government promulgated the 2030 energy policy with the aim of decarbonizing Barbados's electricity. Beyond the 2030 energy policy, the government set a target to decarbonize electricity by 2030 and to introduce a designated percentage of electric vehicles, EVs, by 2030. We were commissioned to undertake an IRRP, Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan, for Barbados, and we undertook a demand forecast, a best cost generation plan, and a transmission plan for 2030. Notice I used the word best cost and not least cost. That will be explained later. Next slide, please. So the figure shows the energy balance at the time of the study. Of note is that more than 50% of electrical energy is lost due to the inherent efficiencies of thermal power plants. That's the green in the top right-hand figure. More than 50%, approaching 60% of electrical energy is lost as losses, because thermal power plants only have an efficiency between 30 and 40%. Electrical generation and transport comprise most of the energy balance demand, with the industrial oil demand comprising the next biggest. So you can see transport on the bottom in blue, bottom right on blue, and you can see industrial oil usage in the brown above the transport. Next slide, please. A demand forecast was undertaken to 2040. Of note in the diagram is the negative demand from demand-side management savings. Also of note is a significant growth in EVs, electric vehicles, to 2040, the gray bars. Residential demand decreases, and this is likely due to behind-the-meter PV and battery storage systems. And as mentioned, although the slide shows the demands as average demands for the years, chronological demand was formulated for each hour of the year for the 20-year duration. Next slide, please. For the generation planning study, 3 scenarios were studied. These were the least cost or no carbon scenario, the least cost carbon price included scenario, and the least cost but with forced use of local indigenous biomass. Next slide, please. Although the demand forecast was undertaken to 2040, the generation planning study was done to 2030. The figure shows the planned candidate megawatt capacity options to 2030. Of note is the large step increase in battery energy storage, the dark blue bars at the bottom, solar, yellow bars, wind, turquoise bars at the top, and even concentrated solar power, CSP, small gold bars at the top under the wind. HFO and diesel plants decline, the black and dark gray, but capacity remains for flexibility and dispatchability. Behind the meter solar rooftop is assumed to increase, shown in red. Next slide, please. The forecasted energy picture in megawatt hours shows a dramatic decrease in HFO and diesel thermal plants, with a corresponding large increase in renewable energy. Of note is the positive and negative contribution to energy from the batteries, the purple bars at the bottom. This is because batteries need energy to charge and provide energy when discharging. Next slide, please. The left-hand figure shows the weekly generation dispatch profiles at the commencement of the study, with HFO and diesel in black dominating the dispatch. The right-hand figures show the least cost or best cost dispatch and forced biomass renewables dispatch for 2030. So the top right-hand figure is the least cost, and the bottom right-hand figure was the least cost or best cost with biomass forced, a certain percentage of biomass forced. Notice the large contribution of solar, wind, and batteries, and the drop in importance of HFO and diesel. Next slide, please. As a result of additional generation, the unserved energy drops significantly over the 10-year study period for all 3 study scenarios. Next slide. This figure shows the cumulative capacity additions over the 10-year study period. Notice the decommissioning of HFO under the line and diesel plants, the negative numbers, and the large battery on the top left, solar in the middle on the top, and the wind on the right. Next slide, please. This slide shows a schematic representation or system single line diagram of the transmission grid and the power grid. Thermal, wind, and solar generation is dispersed across the system, even if renewable resources are not necessarily the highest in these areas. Energy storage is also dispersed across the system, which provides weather impact protection, but also deloads the transmission system in many cases, as excess renewable generation can charge localized battery systems instead of charging remote battery systems and overloading the transmission networks. By placing the renewable generation close to the loads, this also decreased the requirement for excessive new transmission assets and also decreased transmission losses. Synchronous condensers, SCOs, are placed at decommissioned synchronous thermal power plants to provide inertia, fault level, and dynamic voltage and reactive power support. Batteries from electric vehicles can be used for ancillary services, specifically for frequency support and even black start under certain conditions. Electric vehicle loads tend to be dispersed by their nature. Clearly, utility scale battery storage also works in conjunction with the electric vehicle battery storage. This schematic SLD evolves to 2030 as the system demand and generation change. Next slide, please. As Barbados is in the Caribbean and in the hurricane belt, it is prone to severe storms and infrastructure damage. One way of improving system resilience is to divide the island into electrical sub-islands, as shown in the figure. So if a storm damages assets on the right-hand side of the figure, those red circuit breakers, those bold red circuit breakers can be opened, and the two left-hand islands can operate while the right-hand island is restored and then can be resynchronized using resynchronization relays between the islands. The load and the generation in the decided islands should be matched so that the islands can operate effectively. Next slide, please. I'm not sure of my time, Tristan, but I'll carry on until I'm asked to stop.
Yeah, you have another 3-4 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things I said at the beginning was least cost and best cost. And Barbados exhibited some quite interesting non-technical aspects. So besides the technical cost and resilience criteria used in the IRRP, other less quantitative criteria or qualitative criteria were also used to evaluate the three main study scenarios. For example, because Barbados is a small island, roughly 30 kilometers by 20 kilometers, land is scarce, and there are competing uses for land, such as agriculture, residential, commercial, tourism, and electricity generation. Whilst the IRRP recommended large increments of solar PV, this energy source would require large tracts of land. Similarly, Barbados does not have mountains or large rivers, so water is only available from scarce underground aquifers. Some generation scenarios enabled higher levels of employment. Example, the local biomass option for the planting, harvesting, and processing of biomass. However, for this option, the planting of biomass crops competed with agricultural crops for food. The generation scenarios with the highest wind increments would have the highest visual pollution impact, and thermal projects would have other biophysical impacts. Some scenarios were more at risk of extreme climate than others. Next slide. A spreadsheet matrix was formulated which calculated the importance of an individual criterion impact from 1 to 10 and the extent that the scenario impinged on that criterion. From this spreadsheet, a total multi-criteria impact of each scenario, including cost, was formulated. Scenario net present value or cost was also a criterion in the overall multi-criteria assessment to be evaluated in conjunction with other criteria. A sensitivity analysis was undertaken on the weightings in the multi-criteria spreadsheet, and scenarios which consistently scored the highest were considered to be the best scenarios or the most robust scenarios on a wide range of criteria. And spider diagrams were formulated to show the results of the individual criteria for the different sensitivities. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul Tuson, for the excellent presentation of the two case studies that are totally different kinds. So the Uzbekistan is the one with land interconnection, and while the Barbados is not, but it has an aggressive plan, right, to achieve the 100% renewable energy and to become a carbon neutral island. Okay, so for the audience, if you have any question, you can keep your question and we can ask at the end of the seminar, or you can type in the chat box. Yeah. Okay, thanks again, Mr. Paul Tuson. So now we will move to the next presentation